Hello, my name is Martin Forsberg, and I'm going to do a short presentation on some aspects related to implementation of e-invoicing on sub-central level. This presentation was also part of a webinar which was arranged in December, where we also had presentations on the status of in the countries Ireland, Sweden, and Romania. Those presentations can be found in the knowledge base on CEF Digital. So the presentation now will focus on some aspects, starting with some basic information on e-invoicing, and then looking into how different countries have implemented the European Directive and how they are implementing e-invoicing for the requirements that are stated in the Directive. So one very basic question. If you ask your suppliers or your buyers in the private and public sector, what is an electronic invoice? You will probably be faced with very different answers. For example, in many countries, or for many suppliers, a PDF invoice is an electronic invoice. That is how they see an electronic invoice. Also, if some buyers consider that they are working with e-invoicing since they have a system or a workflow system that has digitalized the paper process by scanning the papers, so they are working electronically with the invoices. And then finally, some users consider e-invoices to be the exchange of structured invoice data in a specific format. It's hard to say which is true and false generally, but in the context of the new e-invoicing directive, we have a definition, and this definition says that an electronic invoice has been issued, sent, and received in an electronic form, and it's in a structured format. So in the context of the European Directive, PDF invoices or scanning of paper invoices is not considered to be an e-invoice. Looking a bit closer on one of the articles of the directive, we see that it says that the member states shall ensure that the contracting authorities and contracting entities must be able to receive and process electronic invoices which comply with the European standard on electronic invoicing. And then it also says that you must be able to receive with any of the syntaxes on the list. So we have a few things here that needs a bit more explanation. The European standard on electronic invoicing, that is the business term, the data, the information in the invoice, and any of the syntaxes means that there is a limited list of technical formats that must be possible to receive. So the invoice must be issued, transmitted, and received. And we have the semantic data model, European standard, which describes the business terms and the rules, such as invoice number, VAT amount, buyer's information, seller information, and so on. And then we have the two syntaxes, UBL 2.1 and cross-industry invoice. And the business terms are mapped by syntax bindings to these formats. So these two formats are mandatory for all public entities to receive, and the suppliers can choose whichever of them they prefer. Naturally, as a user, the technical aspects of this is not really evident. You are working with an invoice presented in your systems, looking as any other invoice you're used to. Some key dates. 18th of April 2019 was a deadline for member states to transpose the directive into national law, but there is also a possibility for extension, to have an extended deadline, with a deadline 18th of April 2020, and that is only for sub-central authorities. The European Commission and CEF has country fact sheets where you can find information on the state of implementation of e-invoicing in each member state. It's a very good source to learn more about the different countries. And reading in these country fact sheets, you will find that 25 out of 28 of the member states have, at this point in time, and now we're talking about December 2019, have transposed the directive into law. 13 have requested an extra year for the subcentral transposition, and 23 out of 28 member states say that they have an e-invoicing solution in operation. So there are some countries that are lagging behind a bit and have they're still working on the transposition. You can see here on the map, the green ones are okay, while there are a few that are still not completely ready yet. And then we had the countries that asked for the extension for the subcentral level, which is quite a number of countries that are now preparing for municipalities and regions and so on to be ready for receiving electronic invoices. The directive on electronic invoicing in public procurement is trying to address several needs, and it can provide benefits of different types. It gives optimization of the payment process, also important aspect, simplification of cross-border procurement. So if you're a supplier and have customers in many countries, you're supposed to be able to use the same invoicing system to reach all of your customers. It optimizes the interoperability, of course, and it helps to automate the e-invoicing process, which is a significant task for many buyers for the approval process and matching and so on. It helps the traceability of spending, and also it can be an improvement in tax collection works. And looking at the different member states, some of these goals have been more prioritized than others. We have countries looking mostly at the potential of automation, while other countries are more interested in avoiding tax evasion and so on. The directive only says that the requirement is that the public entities must be able to receive according to the standard, invoices according to the standard. It doesn't say that the suppliers must send electronic invoices, but the directive also sets the minimum the minimum level. So you can also, many countries have gone further, and we see typically three strategies, so three approaches when it comes to the transposition. One group of countries just implement the directive as is, with no additional restrictions. So in those countries, it is still allowed to send paper invoices, but all the public entities must be able to receive electronic invoices in case the supplier wants to. Also, the directive relates to electronic invoices that comes from contracts above threshold. Some countries has implemented just as the directive says, but they also have further requirements, not necessarily in the law, but other types of policies, that when the public entities are making procurements and tenders, they should have contractual requirement that the winner must use electronic invoicing. So that is another approach of getting acceptance and onboarding of suppliers by requiring them through contract instead of law. And then we have a third group of countries which have legal requirements on the suppliers to send. So for example, Denmark, Italy, Sweden, Spain, Croatia, and more countries, where paper invoices is forbidden, essentially. You have to send electronic invoices. So when it comes to onboarding and to get the most out of e-invoicing, the member states have they are in different positions. Some have now, as we just mentioned, mandatory e-invoicing, so they will have 100% or almost 100% electronic invoices more or less overnight, while others will have to work very hard to onboard suppliers and to explain the benefits of e-invoicing to get the suppliers to move from paper to electronic invoices. And what we see now on the screen is, can say, these different levels of readiness, where starting with just be able to comply, which is necessary for all the public entities to receive and to process. But then if you want to really take advantage of electronic invoices, you have to start building knowledge, both on internally with your staff internally, and also to work with informing your suppliers. Then active work with onboarding of new suppliers requires, it needs to be prioritized, and you need to spend resources on this task. And when you get more and more suppliers onboarded, you can start to take advantage of the e-invoicing by building automation, get a secure payment process, and so on. And then finally, the next step could be to also start using e-procurement, e-ordering, and by that getting better statistics, better prices and deliveries, and so on. And it's a stepwise approach. You need to at least comply, but then to get advantage of your investments, you also need to work on this. So looking at it a little bit in more detail on the compliance, you have to be able to receive messages or invoices according both to UBL and the cross-industry invoice syntax. So you have to have a solution in place to process them, and to receive some kind of platform is necessary with some sort of mechanism of receiving. There are different approaches on this, but it's important to take interoperability into account to allow for cross-border usage. So if you have suppliers in another country, they must be able to submit invoices. So be careful with, for example, requiring the national eID solution to log in to a platform, or other things that might become a barrier. It's a good idea to align with other countries to simplify to simplify that for the suppliers. And for the processing part, ambition level differs a lot between the member states. Full automation requires pretty advanced solutions, but to get the advantage, to take advantage from e-invoicing, you need to have a good solution workflow in place to help distribute the invoice internally, to help with the matching, to help with the controls. Otherwise, the electronic invoice will not give much more benefit than what you have in paper already. So one approach which many countries have taken is to have a centralized system, so like a centralized platform. It could be that in a country there has been an e-procurement solution for the public entities where all the tenders are published, and this solution is also now the entry point for electronic invoices. In this case, the suppliers can have a manual entry, so a web form where they can enter, key in the invoice manually. And then it is often common where a proprietary protocol, some kind of file transfer mechanism is set up. Proprietary in the sense that it's connected to this centralized system, and it is not a standardized approach on an international level. So this is we've seen several countries taking this as the first step to be able to comply to the directive. Was that many suppliers have customers in several countries, and they might have their solutions being provided by IT providers from other countries. And if every country has its own solution that perhaps requires their own protocols and their own security mechanism, then it will be a big problem for the suppliers. One way to handle this is to have an access point, so a way for any supplier to connect in a standardized way to the buyers. So in addition to what's already in place with manual entry proprietary protocols, the suppliers can use an access point sending messages that way. Typical solution for this is the PEPL infrastructure, which is using the CEF e-delivery standards to send and receive messages. Centralized platform is one approach, but it's also quite common that the public entities are to procure for their own solution. It's not always that you have a centralized platform. Instead, it might be that that a municipality has its own ERP system, its own workflow system, and then they also have to cater for be able to receive electronic invoicing through this. And since it will then be many entry points in the public sector in one country, it's also important to have an efficient mechanism of addressing and sending the invoices. Again, access points and e-delivery is the preferred solution here. So with that in mind, having the technical aspects in place, the next step would be to start working internally to get a widespread understanding of what e-invoicing is. It's important to have support from management. This is not a technical thing. It's very much a change process related to the users and the way the buyer and the seller do business. So internally, create awareness, explain the benefits, and plan for an efficient use. It's important to think about what are the necessary changes, and to have to provide trainings and get these solutions widely implemented. And towards suppliers, very important to keep the information straightforward and accessible. Stay away from technical descriptions. It's very, very important to explain the benefits. Also, aligning strategies on country level and even European level is a good idea. And also avoid pointing towards specific commercial solutions. E-invoicing is an industry where many solution providers coexist and work and compete with each other, and it's not a good idea to force all suppliers to use one specific commercial solutions. It's important to let them use their own ERP system for be able to integrate efficiently. Here's two examples of how to communicate with your suppliers. It's the Swedish Coast Guard who are using the PEPL infrastructure to receive electronic invoices, and on their website under About Us and Invoicing, they say that the preferred method for receiving electronic invoices is via the PEPL network. The Swedish Coast Guard's electronic address in PEPL is, and then a number. This is pretty straightforward. It's 2 sentences that gives the information necessary for the supplier to make sure that he can send electronic invoices. And to the left, we have another example from the University of Gothenburg, who have similar information, which has been sent out to all their suppliers. So when we have the understanding and the knowledge internally, we have started to inform our suppliers. We also need to expand the usage and onboard our suppliers. Now we're thinking primarily for those countries that haven't mandated electronic invoicing by law. In those countries, the suppliers will have to onboard automatically. They have a very, very strong incentive to do so. But in the countries where e-invoicing isn't required, then you have to explain the benefits and to find incentives for the suppliers to take this step. And one good starting point is to look at your all the suppliers for a specific buyer and see how many invoices per year do each supplier produce, and how do you want to process these invoices, and how mature is the supplier. So by understanding your suppliers a bit better, you can build a strategy. So how should we contact them? How should we prioritize them? And what potential incentives should we offer? And in the onboarding, it's also a good idea to avoid a process where you need manual intervention for each onboarding. So if you have to manually set up or configure the system for each new supplier, that might become a barrier for widespread use in the end. And then remember that the suppliers may have limited capabilities. Avoid too advanced requirements in relation to e-invoicing formats. It's easy to dream up the perfect solution and to put a lot of requirements exactly on how the supplier must fill in what references to use, order matching and so on. But remember that some suppliers have some limitations, so it's important to consider these aspects and balance them. So here we have an example of a typical distribution of invoices per supplier, and on the left side of the diagram you have a few suppliers with a lot of invoices every year, and then you have a long tail of suppliers with a few invoices. And of course the ones with a high volume will give return on effort very quickly. If you can onboard them, you will have gained a lot of electronic invoices electronically. But it's also important to consider the long tail at the same time. So again, have a simple process for onboarding that don't require a lot of manual intervention every time you have a new supplier. And the grouping between here is also something that can be prioritized after you have got the high volume suppliers in place. To start to take advantage, here let's say now that the buyer is having a significant number of electronic invoices, perhaps 50% or 60-70%, then it's important to have a system in place which allow for as much automated processing as possible. So an electronic workflow that minimizes the manual intervention, for example, by using a reference to be able to let the invoice flow directly to the person who is to assess the invoice, rather than to have like a hub that have to look at the invoice and by that see who should assess this invoice. This can be automatically handled in the workflow by using references. Also, evaluation and matching of different objects and orders. And also it's important to use the structured data to find errors and learn about your spending. So this requires somewhat advanced solutions. We can just take a few examples here of how to work, and on the screen we see a blue arrow coming from left to right, and this is how it's described here. First the invoice comes to your service provider or your access point. It's entered into the e-invoicing workflow, and then finally you're booking into account and a payment is made. So the invoice is received. Since it's a known supplier in this case, it's automatically handed over to the one who did the purchase, who is able to assess, did I get the product, has it been delivered, and it can be okayed. And depending on your process, it might be that your manager needs to approve the final approval before it's being booked into account and the payment is initiated. So this would be a process where you have a manual assessment using the buyer reference to get the invoice to appear automatically at the right desk or on the right screen without manual intervention. And we have in the European standard a specific field for this, the buyer reference, which with the purpose to be used for workflows. Another approach is when you have some invoiced objects, such as a subscription or a telecom, mobile phone invoices, energy or rent. In those cases, we have the invoice being received again. It's a known supplier, so it's directly being handed over to be matched against a registered object. And then beforehand, the buyer has defined rules associated with each object. So let's say that if it's a mobile phone invoice, then the amount must be below 50 euros. If it's below 50 euros, it will be automatically approved and paid. I know examples of buyers who have rules saying, for example, it has to be below 50 euros, but also it has to be above 20 euros. And by having that rule, every invoice that every telephone which hasn't been used, obviously it has, in this case it would have an amount which is lower than 20 euros. So then you can identify those phones and to discontinue those subscriptions because no one are using them. So that was a way of, in a big organization, to find out that you have subscriptions which are not used. This is an efficient way of working, and normally thought between perhaps 30 and 50% of the invoice, the number of the invoice volumes can be handled in this way. And there is a specific element called invoice object identifier in the European standard that can be used to matching against this registered object for automatic matching. We also have order matching, of course. So if you have a procurement system and you have issued an electronic order and the supplier has received this order with an order number, he can enter the order number on the invoice. And in that case, you can have in your system automatic routine to automatically validate that the invoice is referencing the correct order. You can check that the goods have been received, and in that case it can be automatically paid. So only those invoices that deviate from what has been ordered will require manual intervention. And in the European standard we have business terms for the order reference, and also on line level you can refer to the order line. It's also important to prepare for invoices that comes from unknown suppliers, both for the reason that they might be fraudulent invoices, but also for suppliers which you have not yet entered into your system, if you have a new contract perhaps, or of some other reason. And then it's important to have a process that tests and verifies that the supplier is correct, and some way of accepting it, approving the supplier, and when that's done, then the invoice can be handled automatically. And just to give an example, using here the city of Skövde in Sweden, this is from 2018, these numbers. They received 125,000 invoices in total. 18% were paper invoices. The rest were electronic. And in the case of Skövde, 37% of all the invoices were handled through the buyer reference. So it required a manual assessment, but the invoice was possible to steer directly to the relevant person in the buyer organization for manual assessment. And then 25% had order matched invoices. So these were verified by software, and only those that are deviating or were not correct will require manual intervention. And 18% were periodical or non-ordered invoices. So, for example, energy, rent, telecom, and so on. And looking at this, that when starting with e-invoicing, probably the buyer reference approach will be the absolute majority. Perhaps all of the invoices are of this type, but you can work to move these invoices into being order matched or periodical or automatically matched. So even if you have 100% electronic invoices, it's very possible that there is a tremendous upside and potential in starting to work more efficiently with the processing of the invoice. So the final step in the level of readiness is then to take e-ordering and e-tendering into account, and e-delivery. And when you have electronic orders, catalogs, dispatch advices, and so on, you will have the possibility to get better ordering procedures, to order only the correct items from the contracting suppliers by using the catalogs, for example, only with the correct prices and in a simple way. That would also result in that you get goods on the correct items delivered at the correct time to the correct location, and which will then finally also give you possibility for automated approval of the invoice, which could be paid in time and correctly booked into account. And this leads to a lot of benefits, such as the potential of lower prices and increased contract loyalty, better monitoring, enhanced security, environmental friendly, and so on and so on. So here is the final goal of taking e-invoicing to the next steps, and also looking at e-procurement. So that was this part of the presentation from the webinar in December. We have important dates coming up. The deadline for the sub-central implementation on the 18th of April. On the 21st of April, there's an e-invoicing event. We will read more about that on CEF Digital. So CEF e-invoicing offers several services that you can take advantage of. Operational services, a conformance testing test bed. There's a service desk. There are trainings available. Several webinars have been recorded previously, which you can access. CEF Digital also have a knowledge base with the country fact sheets, a catalog of good practices, and much more. So I urge you to visit CEF Digital in the e-invoicing section. So thank you very much for listening to this, and hope to hear from you again.